He owned more than most nations. A single Roman citizen, not a king, not an emperor, but a private man, held a personal fortune so vast that historians still struggle to contextualize it 2,000 years later. And the most unsettling part? He built it by understanding something about wealth that most people around him never figured out, something that still applies today. Ancient Rome was not one economy. It was a dozen economies layered on top of each other, each with its own rules, its own ceilings, and its own traps. And where you started determined almost everything about where you could go. Almost. About 90% of the Roman population lived near subsistence level, earning just enough to survive from one harvest to the next. Not poverty by misfortune, poverty by design. The system was built to keep most people exactly where they were. And yet, some escaped. A freed slave became richer than senators. A merchant sailor turned sea routes into generational wealth. A soldier collected a single bonus payment worth 10 years of wages. The ladder existed. It was just brutally steep, and the rungs were hidden. Imagine waking up in Rome in the first century. You are not a citizen of glory. You are a hired laborer, what the Romans called a mercenarius, mercenarius. Your day begins before sunrise. By Diocletian's edict in the early 4th century, a common laborer's daily wage was set at 25 denarii. A skilled artisan, a carpenter, a mason, could earn twice that. That wage, translated into modern purchasing power through grain equivalents, amounted to roughly 250 to 300 kilograms of wheat per year for an average laborer. Enough to eat, barely enough for a family, nothing left over to save, to invest, or to climb. And this is the first trap of the Roman economy. And of any economy, really. When your entire income disappears into survival, you have nothing left to convert into the next rung. Economists call this the subsistence trap. You can't build wealth you can't save. But Rome offered one lifeline for the poor that softened the edge: the grain dole. The Roman state distributed free wheat to roughly 200,000 citizens in the capital by the late Republic. It wasn't generosity. It was political engineering. But for the urban poor, it was a floor, a minimum below which you couldn't quite fall. Now look one level up. The artisan, the glassblower, the bronze sculptor, the baker running his own stall. These people occupied an uncomfortable middle ground in Roman society. Better paid, slightly more stable, but still a long way from the elite. Here's what's fascinating about Roman skilled trades. The people most likely to dominate them were not free-born citizens. They were freedmen, formerly enslaved people who had been granted freedom, often after years of skilled labor performed for their masters. Henrik Mauritsen's research shows freedmen dominated skilled trades and commerce in Rome, sometimes surpassing free-born citizens in accumulated wealth. Think about what that means. The people society had placed at its absolute lowest point, enslaved, owned, legally property, were, in practice, some of the most economically mobile individuals in the entire empire. Not because the system was fair, because they had been trained in skills that the market valued, and once free, they were willing to use them. Petronius wrote a satirical character called Trimalchio, a freedman of obscene wealth who threw lavish dinners and boasted endlessly about his rise. Romans laughed at him, but they also recognized him, because Trimalchio wasn't fantasy, he was observation. And then there was Pallas, Palus, secretary to Emperor Claudius, a freed slave who handled the correspondence of an empire. His personal fortune was reportedly 300 million sestertii, more than most senators ever dreamed of holding. The man who had once been property became, functionally, one of the wealthiest people in the known world. So, what was the mechanism? How did a freedman cross from skilled labor into merchant wealth? The answer is commerce, and specifically the willingness to take on risk that the Roman elite refused to touch. Roman senators were legally prohibited from engaging in trade or commerce directly. The elite considered it beneath their dignity. But they still wanted the profits, so they used freedmen as agents, intermediaries who conducted business on their behalf. This meant freedmen sat at the center of Roman commercial life, building networks, learning markets, accumulating contacts. Commercial traders operated Rome's long-distance trade networks, and those networks were staggeringly profitable for one simple reason: sea trade. Stanford's Orbis model calculates that Roman maritime transport was 60 times cheaper per unit than moving goods overland. 60 times. That meant a merchant who could put goods on a ship was operating with an almost incomprehensible cost advantage over everyone competing on land. The sea route from Alexandria to Rome's port at Ostia was one of the most lucrative corridors in the ancient world. Egyptian grain, Syrian glass, Spanish olive oil, Gallic wine. The merchant who could finance a cargo and survive the crossing didn't just profit, he compounded. Compounding. The process of earning returns on previous returns so that wealth grows on itself is as old as commerce itself. It is the single most powerful force in building wealth across any era, and it only works if you have something to start with. But maritime trade carried enormous risk. Ships sank, pirates existed, markets crashed. So Rome developed a primitive form of maritime insurance called a sea loan. A financier would lend money for a voyage at high interest, and if the ship sank, the debt was canceled. This let merchants take on voyages they couldn't personally finance. Now we arrive at the equestrian class, the second tier of Roman society. To hold equestrian status, you needed 400,000 sestertii in property. Not income. Property. This distinction matters enormously. Wealth in Rome was measured not by what you earned, but by what you owned. Equestrians were the investor class of Rome. They could hold state contracts, including tax farming, where private investors paid the government upfront for the right to collect taxes in a province and kept whatever exceeded that amount. The returns could be extraordinary, and the risk was borne by the taxpayers. Above the equestrians stood the senators. To hold senatorial rank, you needed at least 1 million sestertii in property. 1 million, in a world where most people earned 25 denarii a day, and yet even senators were not the ceiling. Marcus Licinius Crassus, Krasus, held a personal fortune estimated at 200 million sestertii, approximately 7,000 times the annual wage of a common laborer. If you earned the median American household income today and multiplied it by 7,000, you would have over $1.3 billion. Crassus was, in modern terms, a billionaire in a world of daily wage earners. How did he build it? Not through a single source. He owned silver mines. He owned urban real estate, famously buying burning buildings at fire sale prices and then extinguishing the flames with his private fire brigade. And he invested in slaves, trained them in skilled trades, and hired them out to workshops, collecting passive income without lifting a hand himself. Passive income, money that works while you sleep. Crassus didn't extinguish fires. His slaves did. He collected the rents afterward. The concept is ancient. The advantage it creates is just as real today. The Roman military offered a different ladder, one that didn't require starting capital, only courage and time. A Roman legionary was a professional soldier paid a regular salary. But the real moment came at the end of service. The discharge bonus under Augustus was 3,000 denarii, roughly 10 years of base pay, delivered in a single payment. Emperors also used military payments as political tools. On accession, when a new emperor took power, Soldiers could receive donatives equivalent to 1 to 5 years of annual salary, paid immediately. These weren't just gifts, they were contracts. But for the soldier who survived and collected, they represented a sudden, substantial injection of capital at a critical moment. The veterans who used that capital wisely, buying land, setting up small trades, lending within their communities, could establish families a full social tier above where they began. Military service was, for many Romans, the most reliable escalator out of the laboring class. And land, always, in Rome, land was the bedrock of everything. To hold senatorial rank, to claim equestrian status, to matter in any permanent way, you needed land. Not because land was especially profitable year to year, but because land was permanent. It survived famines, outlasted emperors, and could be passed to children. In an economy without banks, without stock markets, without retirement accounts, land was the savings account, the investment portfolio, and the insurance policy all in one. It was the one asset that compounded socially as well as economically. So we have a complete picture. At the bottom, wage labor, enough to survive, nothing more. One level up, skilled trades and commerce, mobile, stigmatized, but capable of producing elite level returns. Then equestrian investment, state contracts, maritime lending. Then the senatorial class, land and political power. And above all of them, a handful of men whose wealth compounded across all channels simultaneously. Now walk forward 2,000 years, because the structure hasn't changed as much as we'd like to believe. The median American household held a net worth of $192,700 in 2022, according to the Federal Reserve. That sounds like a lot, until you realize the top 1% of American households hold more total wealth than the entire middle 60% of Americans combined. The shape of that distribution is, in its proportions, strikingly Roman. Raj Chetty's landmark research found that only 50% of Americans born in 1984 earned more than their parents, compared to 90% of those born in 1940. The escalator is slowing. The rungs of the ladder are farther apart than they used to be. And if you are born into the bottom income quintile, the lowest 20% of earners, you have only an 8% chance of reaching the top quintile in your lifetime. 8%. In ancient Rome, if you were born into the laboring class, your odds of reaching senatorial wealth were not meaningfully different. Different civilization, same arithmetic. But here is what Rome teaches us that pure statistics can't. The people who climbed, the freedmen merchants, the soldier turned landowners, the maritime traders, almost never did it by out-earning their station. They did it by changing which game they were playing. The laborer traded time for money. The merchant traded risk for return. The equestrian traded capital for contracts. Wealth in Rome and now is not primarily a function of how hard you work. It is a function of what your money, or your skills, or your network does while you aren't working. Crassus didn't extinguish fires. His slaves did. He collected the rents afterward. Now return for a moment to where we started. That private Roman citizen, not a king, not an emperor, sitting atop a fortune that beggared nations. His name was Crassus. And he didn't build it by being born at the top. He built it by understanding, with brutal clarity, that the real game was never about wages. The deepest truth Rome leaves us with is simple enough to say in one sentence, and hard enough to live by. The people who accumulate wealth are rarely those who earn the most. They're the ones who figured out how to stop trading their hours for it. That was true in the 1st century. It is true in the 21st. The latter hasn't changed. Only the names of the rungs have.